The first thing I remember about that morning wasn't the sound of boots forming ranks. It was the fog. A thick riverbank fog had crept across the fields outside Washington, spilling over the grassy ridges like a pale tide. It softened every shape it touched: tents, trees, wagons, even the men standing beside me, turning the entire army into a strange, quiet apparition. You couldn't see 50 yards ahead. You could barely see the next company down the line. Yet despite that eerie stillness, you could feel something stirring in the mist. A tension. A pull. A sense that the air itself was waiting. Word had passed through the camp before dawn. The new commander is coming. No one said his name, not at first. It moved between the tents like an echo. McClellan! McClellan is here! We had heard rumors of him for days. The newspapers called him the young Napoleon. The officers spoke of his discipline. The veterans murmured that he could shape raw men into a real army. Whether any of that was true, none of us knew. But after Bull Run, after the panic, the confusion, the humiliation of running all the way back to Washington, we needed something, someone, to believe in. So when the order came to stand at attention, the entire 1st Minnesota stepped forward into the cold morning mist, muskets at our sides, breath rising in thin white clouds. Even the drizzle-slick grass under our boots felt tense with expectation. As the fog shifted, the distant city began to reveal itself, the Washington skyline still half-built, half-dreamed. To our right, the unfinished dome of the U.S. Capitol loomed above the rooftops, its skeletal iron ribs rising like the bones of some great creature not yet covered with flesh. Workers had abandoned the scaffolding after the panic of Bull Run, leaving wooden frames hanging crooked against the dome, creaking faintly in the morning wind. Below it, the city sprawled outward, muddy streets, brick warehouses, rows of wooden houses lining the Potomac, chimneys smoking despite the damp. To our left lay the vast defensive earthworks rising around the Capitol. Redoubts. Bastions. Trenches carved from the red Virginia clay. Fort Corcoran stood closest, a massive timber structure bristling with artillery, its walls slick with rain, pickets pacing its dark ramparts like restless shadows. Beyond the forts, the landscape opened into rolling fields and scattered oak trees, the ground still scarred by thousands of boots that had marched in defeat only days before. And somewhere in that fog-covered world, our new commander approached. A ripple moved down the line, a tightening of shoulders, a straightening of backs. Officers craned their necks. Someone whispered, "He's coming up the slope now." The fog parted slowly, like theater curtains being drawn aside. Then we saw him. A mounted figure emerging from the white haze, flanked by staff officers. His horse's hooves thudded softly on the damp earth, breath steaming in rhythmic bursts. The man rode upright, steady, composed, not proud, but assured, as though he belonged on that horse, on that field, in that moment. General George B. McClellan. His uniform was immaculate, dark frock coat buttoned to the throat, sash tied neatly at the waist, boots polished though the road was mud. His expression was unreadable from a distance, but even through the curtain of mist, something about him seemed deliberate, calculated, watching everything. The men around me stiffened unconsciously. Even the murmurs stopped. The fog muffled every sound except the slow, steady rhythm of hoofs. As he drew closer, I could see his eyes, sharp, assessing, scanning the ranks like a craftsman inspecting raw materials. Not with disdain, not with pity, but with intention. If Bull Run had humbled us, McClellan looked like a man who intended to rebuild us. He halted in front of the line. For a breath, no one moved. No one even dared to swallow. And then he spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying strangely well through the damp air. "Men," he said, "you have seen the worst a green army can face. Now you will become the best an army can be." The words struck harder than any cannon. Not because they were loud. Not because they were boastful. But because they were exactly what we needed, not praise, not comfort, but direction. Around me, I felt something shift. Barely a whisper at first, just a faint crack in the shell of defeat encasing our hearts. Hope. Cautious, fragile, but real. McClellan rode slowly down the line, inspecting each regiment as though memorizing every face. When he passed the 1st Minnesota, his gaze paused for a heartbeat. I do not know if he saw me specifically or simply the state of our battered company, mud-smeared uniforms, tired eyes, muskets worn from battle and retreat, but in that moment, I felt seen. Not as a failure. Not as a runaway volunteer. But as a soldier who could be forged into something stronger. The fog swirled around him as he continued, his horse's outline fading once more into the white veil of morning. But the silence he left behind was different now, thicker, heavier, yet somehow steadier. The men stood straighter. The officers exhaled in relief. Even the fires burning in camp seemed to glow a little brighter. Bull Run had broken us. But McClellan's arrival felt like the first step towards standing again. And as the fog rolled back across the ridge, swallowing the landscape once more, I realized that this moment, quiet, cold, shrouded in mist, marked the true beginning of our war. The fog thinned as the morning wore on, drifting slowly back toward the river like a retreating tide. As it lifted, the world around us took clearer shape, and with it came the reality of our new life, not as passing volunteers, not as rebels against a distant wrong, but as soldiers tasked with defending the capital of the Union. The landscape around Washington had transformed in the short days since Bull Run. What had once been quiet farmland now bristled with fortifications. We could see them rising everywhere, angular earthworks packed with red clay, thick log palisades, platforms reinforced for heavy artillery. It seemed as if the very ground had erupted into walls. Fort Corcoran loomed nearest, its raw timber still pale from the sawmills, cannons jutting out with cold gleams of iron. Farther off stood Fort Runyon, its broad ramparts facing the long bridge, guarding the approach like a silent sentinel. Between these forts lay a growing orchestra of activity, wagons rattling along half-formed roads, carpenters hammering new structures into place, engineers marking out lines for future defenses. Stretched canvas tents dotted the fields in long, uneven rows, little white islands amid churned mud. Smoke curled from 100 cook fires, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp wood and boiled coffee. Our regiment settled on a slight rise overlooking the Potomac Valley. From that vantage, we could see the river shine faintly in the morning haze, a long silver ribbon winding through the trees. Beyond it lay the city, Washington, still awkwardly half-formed, neither frontier town nor grand capital, but something caught in between. Brick houses stood beside wooden sheds, muddy alleys cut between broad unfinished boulevards, scaffolding climbed the sides of public buildings like skeletal vines. The Capitol dome was the most striking sight of all, not yet whole, an iron-ribbed cage rising into the sky. The incomplete structure took on different appearances depending on the light, noble at sunrise, ghostly at dusk, wounded after the rain. I often wondered if it reflected the nation itself, half-built and filled with scaffolding, its final shape uncertain. Life in the new camps began with labor, hard labor, endless labor. No sooner had we set down our packs than officers ordered the men to dig drainage ditches around the tent lines. The ground was slick with mud, each step sinking with a wet slurp, but the work kept our hands busy and our thoughts from drifting too far into yesterday's horrors. Shovels scraped. Picks bit into the clay. The wet earth released a cold, metallic smell each time we turned it over. Water pooled at the bottom of the trench as fast as we cleared it. My shoulders burned from the strain, but the effort steadied me. There was something honest about digging, a task that demanded attention, not imagination. Around us, units from all over the North were doing the same. I saw the bright green jackets of the 79th New York Highlanders trudging past, kilts muddied, boots heavy. The 14th Brooklyn lined their street with boardwalks to keep their tents from sinking. Further down the ridge, a New Hampshire regiment erected a makeshift church tent, the chaplain directing the men with gentle insistence. Everywhere, the sound of axes rang out as details were sent to fell nearby trees. Soon the landscape took on a scarred, stripped look, as if the forest were shrinking backward from the army's presence. Timber went straight to the engineers, who were building new gun platforms, reinforced huts, or strengthening the forts. By midday, the sun had broken through enough to cast long shadows. They stretched across the camp like fingers, reaching from tent to tent, touching every man regardless of rank or age. The heat returned with it, a humid, sticky warmth that clung to the skin and made wool uniforms feel like wet blankets. Sweat ran down our faces as we labored. During a short break, Jensen and I stood near a water barrel, cups in hand. The water tasted of wood and iron, but it refreshed us all the same. "Never thought soldiering meant so much digging," he muttered, rolling his shoulders. "It's a different kind of battlefield," I replied. He grinned faintly. "One without bullets, at least." Yet the echoes of Bull Run lingered. Even in this bustling camp, the memory remained close, a shadow lying in the grass beside each man. You could see it in the way some flinched when a wagon wheel cracked loudly, or how others gazed southward with tightened jaws, half expecting gray uniforms to spill over the hills. But with every shovel of earth, every hammered stake, every lifted tent pole, something new settled into the army, a slow, growing sense of purpose. We were building more than walls. We were building resolve. As the afternoon stretched on, an order came for the regiment to assemble near the parade ground. The men shuffled into formation, straightening their belts and wiping sweat from their brows. The ground there was worn smooth by the boots of thousands, and a faint dust rose as we took our places. From the ridge, the view was remarkable. The Potomac glimmered softly below us, flanked by wide fields cut with wagon tracks. Across the water the unfinished Capitol rose like an iron crown above the mist of the city. And behind us, the forts formed a jagged ring of timber and clay, the raw bones of the great defenses that would soon guard Washington. In that moment, I realized just how vast the task before the Union truly was. Not only reclaiming the ground lost at Bull Run, but building an army capable of marching deep into enemy territory. Fortifying the capital was only the first step. The war ahead would demand far more than we had yet given. We stood waiting as officers checked the alignment of the companies, their voices sharp, their movements precise. The retreat had wounded their pride as surely as it had wounded ours. Now they moved with renewed purpose, eager to restore order. The sun hung high above the ridge, warm enough to dry the damp on our sleeves. A faint breeze stirred the torn edges of the flagpole, causing the Union flag to flutter weakly. Its colors looked muted by smoke and weather, but still it held, like us, battered but standing. As I gazed down the long line of tents and fortifications, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. We were far from ready. But we were no longer the broken remnants who had run in panic through the Virginia night. We were becoming something else. Something stronger. And with McClellan's arrival, the shaping of this army had only just begun. The first full day under McClellan's command began not with rest, nor speeches, nor comforting promises, but with the sharp crack of an officer's voice cutting through the heavy morning air. "Fall in! Company formation, on the double!" It was barely after sunrise. Fog still clung to the low ground, curling around the tents like pale smoke. The canvas shone with dew, each droplet catching the growing light like tiny beads of glass. The air smelled of damp earth, sweat, and the faint tang of wood smoke drifting from the cook fires beginning to stir. We scrambled into ranks, adjusting straps and belting cartridge boxes, fumbling slightly as we hurried into position. The parade ground, a flattened expanse of packed dirt bordered by newly erected officers' tents, spread before us, framed by the rising bulwarks of Fort Corcoran behind. The fort's long timber walls loomed like a stern guardian watching over the field, its embrasures dark, silent, and solemn. McClellan's voice did not reach us that morning, but his presence did, through the crisp precision in every command, the sudden urgency in every officer's stride, the unmistakable sense that the army had been set upon a new path. The relaxed, uncertain days after Bull Run were gone. In their place stood something harder, sharper, and altogether unfamiliar. Our drillmaster, Lieutenant Parker, strode out before the regiment. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth, leaving clear imprints that seemed to underscore the authority in his tone. "Gentlemen," he said, surveying us, "you are no longer volunteers holding muskets. You are soldiers of the Army of the Potomac. And by God, you will learn to move like soldiers." No one dared challenge him. Even the habitual grumblers of the company stood straighter. The drill began with simple maneuvers. Shoulder arms. Present arms. Order arms. Movements we knew well enough, or thought we did. But under Parker's eye, every flaw became visible. If a rifle but struck the earth too heavily, he heard it. If a man hesitated even half a heartbeat, Parker pounced. Too slow. Again. Align that row, straight in the dressing. You. Keep your eyes front. We are not a rabble, we are an army. Again. The sun rose higher, burning away the fog, revealing the full sprawl of the camp. Tents glowed cream-colored in the light. Logistics wagons creaked down muddy lanes. Engineers could be seen in the distance marking out new lines for fortifications, their theodolites standing on tripods like brass-eyed sentinels. Carpenters hammered rhythmically on gun platforms. The sharp, metallic tapping mingled with the growing clatter of bayonets and rifles striking in unison. But our world, for those long hours, shrank to the parade ground and the voice of Lieutenant Parker. After the manual of arms came marching drill. Right shoulder, shift. By the right flank, march. Guide right, steady, steady. We pivoted sharply, perhaps too sharply, several men stumbling as they struggled to maintain alignment. Dust rose from the ground, mixing with the heat radiating from our wool uniforms. Sweat trickled down our backs, our collars damp, rifle slings biting into our shoulders. The regimental band was not yet assembled for daily drill, but a drummer struck a steady cadence from the sidelines, his sticks tapping out a heartbeat that kept our feet in motion. We wheeled by platoons. We advanced in line. We retired in order. We marched in column of fours until our legs burned. We repeated each maneuver until the movements felt less like commands and more like muscle memory. Between commands, men muttered to each other under their breath. This is worse than the battle. Larson huffed beside me. At least in battle, Jensen murmured. You get to stop when you fall down. I managed a weak smile, though my shoulders ached and my throat felt raw. The laughter, even faint, helped. Small sparks of camaraderie flickered between us, easing the strain. But Parker did not relent. We drilled until the sun stood high and hot in the sky. The parade ground shimmered in the heat, a dusty plain bordered by the rising skeleton of military infrastructure. Near the fort, a new barracks building was being framed, raw timbers stacked neatly, carpenters hammering at a feverish pace. Beyond that, the Potomac glinted like a blade under the sunlight. The city of Washington sprawled across the far bank, its unfinished Capitol dome shining like a vast iron crown. It all felt distant, another world entirely from the sweating men struggling to maintain formation. By noon the officers called a short rest. We collapsed near our tents, sluicing water from our canteens over our faces. The water tasted faintly of smoke and metal, likely from the barrels that had been charred before use, but we gulped it down gratefully. Larson rubbed his shoulder with a grimace. Does he mean to kill us before the Confederates do? Jensen shook his head. No. He means to make sure we don't die as easily next time. Those words stayed with me. More than I expected. More than I wanted to admit. After our short rest came firing drill. We practiced loading and firing by command. Ramming cartridges with smooth, rapid strokes. Snapping hammers back. Firing in ranks. Stepping back to reload while the front line fired over our shoulders. Quicker! Parker barked. A good soldier loads his musket 10 times a minute. Larson coughed. 10? I can barely manage half that. That's why we train, I said. The sun dipped lower, painting the earthworks in long shadows. Smoke from repeated discharge drifted across the parade ground, catching the orange light, turning the air into a hazy veil through which we moved like phantoms learning to be men again. By late afternoon, our hands were black with powder, our throats raw from smoke, our legs trembling with fatigue. But our movements had sharpened. Our lines held tighter. Our volleys sounded faster, more unified, less like the scattered barks of frightened volunteers and more like the practiced thunder of soldiers. When Parker finally dismissed us, he surveyed the regiment with a rare, almost hidden glimmer of approval. "That," he said, "is the beginning of an army." As we made our way back to camp, I felt something strange easing into my chest, not pride, not yet, but a sense of becoming. A feeling that we were being reshaped, step by step, into men capable of facing whatever lay ahead. Bull Run had broken us. McClellan's discipline was beginning to rebuild us. And for the first time since that terrible day, I felt a small seed of confidence, fragile, but growing, taking root. Evening settled slowly over the camp, as if the sun itself were reluctant to leave us in the dark again. The day's sweat dried stiff on my uniform, leaving streaks of salt across the blue wool. The aches in my legs pulsed with each step as I returned to my tent, the last smudges of gun smoke clinging to the air like persistent ghosts. The parade ground, which only hours earlier had been alive with drilling soldiers, now lay quiet, flattened earth stamped by the boots of hundreds, faint dust rising in the cooling breeze. Beyond it, the silhouette of Fort Corcoran loomed against the dimming sky, its timber walls jagged and watchful. Lanterns flickered along the ramparts, casting long golden streaks upon the clay. The fort looked almost like a great wooden beast hunched on the ridge, guarding the city behind it. Down the slope, the Potomac shimmered faintly, reflecting the last red hues of sunset. The river drifted slowly, its surface smooth and undisturbed, as if unaware of the turmoil swelling along its banks. Across the water, Washington's skyline came alive with lamplight. I could see the faint glow of gas lamps lining Pennsylvania Avenue, the dark outlines of warehouses and barracks, and the rising ribs of the unfinished Capitol dome standing like a solemn promise against the twilight. But all the beauty of that scene, quiet and serene as it was, could not loosen the weight that pressed against my chest. Bull Run lingered everywhere. The day's drill had pushed the memory to the edges of my mind for a time, but now, with the world calming, my thoughts drifted inexorably backward, to the field, to the chaos, to the things I saw and the things I feared I might see again. I walked a little further from camp, seeking solitude where the noise of men softened into distant murmurs. A small rise overlooked the fields stretching southward. From there, the rolling land dipped gently before rising again into shadowed hills. The grass, still wet with dew and rain, bent under the faint breath of evening wind. Fireflies winked between the stalks, blinking like distant stars fallen to earth. I sat on a flat stone, my musket resting against my knee, and let the memories come. The first was always the smoke, thick and acrid, swallowing everything within minutes of the fighting. Then the sound, rolling in deafening waves, muskets cracking like snap timber, artillery bursting like storms tearing open the sky, officers shouting orders that dissolved before they reached the next company. But worst of all were the memories with faces. Men from the 1st Minnesota who had marched beside me that morning, laughing, confident, adjusting packs as if they were setting out for a holiday, and who by afternoon had vanished into the smoke. Some I saw fall. Others simply disappeared. One moment a man was there, breathing, shouting, firing. The next moment the line surged forward or backward, and he was nowhere to be found. It haunted me. In the city back home, when harvest storms swept across the prairie, I used to watch entire fields bend under the wind, thousands of wheat stalks flattened in one sudden gust. Bull Run felt like that. A storm sweeping across men instead of crops, taking whoever stood in its path. I rubbed my palms together, feeling the calluses forming from the new drills. Even the roughness of my hands felt unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. A twig broke behind me. I turned to see Jensen approaching, his silhouette outlined faintly against the fading light. "Thought I'd find you out here," he said quietly. I nodded, shifting on the stone to make room. "Needed a bit of air. The camp feels crowded tonight." He sat beside me with a soft grunt. "Crowded with thoughts more than men, I reckon." We watched the landscape for a while without speaking. The horizon grew darker, and lantern lights appeared like small islands scattered across the valley. Somewhere behind us, a bugler practiced a call, the notes wavering uncertainly in the cool air. After a moment, Jensen asked, "You thinking about the battle again?" "Hard not to." He drew a long breath. "Same here. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hill. That damned hill. Henry House Hill. The place where so many hopes had broken. The place where our innocence had died. I swallowed. Do you ever wonder why we didn't panic sooner? How we held as long as we did? Jensen shrugged lightly. Maybe we didn't understand what was happening. Maybe not understanding kept us standing. His words struck me in a way I didn't expect. Not understanding. Was that the thin thread that had held us together on the field? The idea that if we simply kept moving, kept firing, kept reloading, we might somehow be spared the truth of the danger? Now, with the clarity that came after defeat, the danger felt sharper. More real. More personal. You think we'll be ready next time? I asked. Jensen pulled at a blade of grass, rolling it between his fingers. We'll be better. Dunno if we'll ever be ready. Maybe no one ever is. He leaned back on his hands, gazing up at the deepening sky. McClellan, though, he added. He's doing something. You can feel it. Like the whole army's bones are being set right. I nodded slowly, though doubt tugged at the edges of my thoughts. Bull Run had exposed truths I hadn't wanted to know, about fear, about death, about how quickly a man could be undone. But it had also revealed something else, something more unsettling. War wasn't going to wait for us to be prepared. We would either become soldiers, or perish trying to. The air grew cooler as night took hold. Crickets chirped from the tall grass. Far off, a wagon rattled unevenly along a dirt road. The camp behind us glowed with small fires and lanterns, each bright point marking a man wrestling with his own memories. After a long silence, Jensen stood and dusted off his trousers. You coming back? He asked. In a minute, I replied. He nodded and walked off, leaving me alone once more with the quiet and the dark. I closed my eyes. Henry Hill rose before me again, the smoke, the cries, the crack of volleys. But now, mixed with fear, another feeling stirred. Determination. If memory was a burden, then perhaps it could also be a guide. If pain was a teacher, then perhaps we were learning at last. I opened my eyes to the night and whispered to no one. Next time, we'll be different men. And in the soft, cool darkness of that Virginia rise, I believed it. The next days settled into a rhythm so unfamiliar, and yet so strangely comforting, that it felt as though a new world had risen around us. Not the broken world of Bull Run, not the ragged chaos of retreat, but something steadier. Something held together by purpose. The camp had a life of its own now. The rows of tents stretched across the hillside in more orderly fashion, each skyline pulled taut, each company street aligned with the next. Smoke from the morning cook fires drifted upward in long columns, softening as it reached the treetops. The low sun cast warm gold over the camp, catching the canvas roofs and the polished rifle barrels stacked in neat pyramids. In the distance, the forts continued to grow. Fort Corcoran's timber walls now bore the scars of 100 axes, the wood darkened by rain and smoke. Engineers had added new platforms reinforced with thick planks, and freshly mounted cannon stared southward like iron-eyed sentinels. Further along the ridge, another series of earthworks took shape, angular shapes carved from red clay, with trenches snaking between them like veins on a living beast. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, we could hear the muffled thud of earth being packed down, or the echo of a hammer striking a spike deeper into the timber frames. The landscape was shifting, piece by piece, into a fortress city. Among all this change, something quieter, yet more profound, was happening within the regiment itself. The 1st Minnesota, once a collection of farm boys, clerks, fishermen, lumbermen, and mill workers, began to move with the cadence of a single body. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't easy. But it was unmistakable. Each morning we drilled until our legs quivered, but by now the commands came sharper, the movements cleaner. When Lieutenant Parker barked, "By the right flank, march!" our line no longer staggered like a snake with two heads. The men pivoted together, shoulders aligned, steps landing in practiced rhythm. Dust rose from our boots in synchronized puffs. Rifles stayed level. Words were few. Precision, real precision, was forming in us. During firing drill, the volleys no longer sounded like scattered firecrackers. They snapped out in unified bursts, sharp and disciplined. And after each volley, the reloads came smoother, hands moving in instinctive patterns, each step practiced, each motion deliberate. Even the officers noticed. "That's proper soldiering," Captain Wilcox remarked one afternoon as we stacked arms after drill. For him, it was high praise. But it wasn't just the discipline that marked our transformation. It was the way the men talked to one another. Where before small groups from the same town stuck together, now conversations flowed freely between any of us. The shared experience of defeat, the long days of drill, the exhaustion we carried shoulder to shoulder, these things bound us tighter than hometown ties ever could. Around the evening fires, laughter returned. Not the careless laughter of men marching to what they thought would be a quick war. This was different, quieter, wryer, born of shared fatigue and the comfort of familiar faces. One evening, Larson and Thompson bickered over who had the worse aim at Bull Run. Jensen chimed in to remind Thompson that he'd fired so high during the battle that a crow flying overhead might have been in more danger than any rebel. Thompson grunted. Well, at least I didn't run out of cartridges and try loading in acorns like Larson here." Larson flushed red. "They looked like bullets in the smoke." The circle around the fire erupted in chuckles. Even Larson managed a smile. Moments like these stitched us together in ways the officers could never enforce. Every man had a story now, stories of the retreat, of the drill, of the aches and pains and small victories. Stories of home. Stories of hopes for the next battle, whenever it came. And we learned each other's strengths. Jensen, steady as a rock, could calm a panicked recruit with a word. Thompson, gruff but reliable, could split firewood twice as fast as anyone else. Larson, though jittery, had eyes sharp enough to spot a sergeant approaching long before the rest of us. And I found myself becoming the quiet observer of the group, the one who listened first, spoke second, and tried to carry the moments that others needed to release. Then came the day that truly marked our change. We were marching along the edge of the parade ground, dust rising beneath our boots, when we noticed a nearby regiment drilling, another volunteer unit, fresh from the north, still green. Their line wobbled as they marched. Their rifles weren't level. Their commands came half a second too late. Our own company watched with a peculiar feeling rising in our chests. Not pride exactly. Not superiority. Something else, something like the first glimmer of confidence. Lieutenant Parker must have sensed it too, because he leaned toward Captain Wilcox and whispered something. Moments later the captain barked. "First Minnesota, forward into line. Prepare to demonstrate company maneuver at the quick time." We snapped into place. What followed was the cleanest, most precise drill we had ever performed. We pivoted on command, marched by the flank, advanced, fired by rank in smooth succession, then wheeled into column again. Every movement crisp. Every step unified. Our rifles gleamed in the afternoon sun as they rose and fell in perfect harmony. When the drill ended, the watching regiment stared in something between awe and disbelief. "That's how soldiers move," someone whispered. For the first time since Bull Run, I felt a warmth rise in my chest, not pride, but a sense of forward motion. As though the pieces of ourselves shattered on that battlefield were finding their way back together. Later that evening, as we sat near the fire, the sky ablaze with streaks of deep orange and purple, Jensen nudged me. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked. "Feel what?" "That we're not the same men who ran from Bull Run." I looked around at the faces caught in the glow of the flames, tired, sunburned, bruised, but steady. "Yes," I said quietly. "Something's changing in us." He nodded. "And I think it's for the better." The fire crackled softly. Beyond our circle, the vast camp murmured with its own life, men laughing, officers calling evening orders, blacksmiths hammering at wagon wheels, the distant thud of earth being packed into new fort walls. The night sky spread above us like a velvet canopy, stars emerging one by one. We were no longer a scattered group of frightened volunteers. We were becoming a unit. A regiment. A brotherhood. And though the war ahead promised hardship beyond imagining, for the first time since the retreat, I believed we might be ready to face it. The nights grew cooler as September crept in, and with the change in weather came a strange mixture of confidence and apprehension across the camp. We had become a different regiment, sharper in our drill, steadier in our step, but even as our bodies hardened, a quiet question lingered in each man's mind. Were we truly becoming soldiers, or only learning to pretend? The landscape around us seemed to wrestle with the same uncertainty. Washington's defenses expanded each day like a living thing, more forts rising along the ridge, trenches deepening, roads widening as wagons carved new paths through the clay. From our camp, we could see the whole transformation, earth reshaped by human hands, the skyline bristling with timbers and artillery. Some mornings I woke just as the sun crested the Potomac, its light spilling gold across the river and turning the half-built Capitol dome into a gleaming silhouette. The city beneath it stirred slowly, chimneys puffing gray threads into the cool air, distant silhouettes of workmen moving along scaffolds. It looked peaceful from afar, almost fragile. And yet, everywhere we looked, reminders of war pushed through the calm. Rows of cannons lined the ramparts of Fort Corcoran. Stacks of ammunition crates were stored beneath canvas covers. Engineers pored over maps on field tables. Couriers galloped along the muddy roads, carrying letters and orders between the units encircling the capital. Despite the structure and purpose that now defined our days, none of us could forget how quickly the illusion of invincibility had been shattered at Bull Run. One evening, after a long day of drill, Jensen and I walked toward the far edge of camp where the ground sloped gently downward to a clearing. The tall grass there swayed slowly in the cool breeze, whispering against our boots. We often went there when we needed a break from camp noise. Somewhere the air felt spacious again. The sky above was a tapestry of deep blues and fiery streaks, the sun just disappearing behind a low ridge. Smoke from the cook fires drifted horizontally, catching the orange light and softening it. "You hear the latest rumor?" Jensen asked, his voice low. "I've heard 10 today," I replied. "Which one?" "That McClellan's planning something big. An offensive. A grand one." I exhaled slowly. "Already?" "Aye. Says he means to train us through fall and winter, then move on Richmond come spring." The idea of marching into Virginia again made something twist in my gut. Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy, deeper than we'd ever ventured. Bull Run had been only a scratch against the enemy's defenses, and that scratch had cost us dearly. But another thought rose alongside the fear. "Do you think we'll be ready?" I asked. Jensen didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to watch the lights flicker across the valley. Officers soundlessly crossed company streets. Far beyond the campfires, the dark outline of Fort Runyon stretched like a great wall against the night. Its cannons, though silent, seemed to whisper of things yet to come. Finally, Jensen spoke. "I think we'll be more ready than we were." "That's something, isn't it?" I nodded. It was something. But still, doubt tugged at the corners of my mind. As darkness deepened, camp activity gradually softened to a hum. The clank of tin cups. The low murmur of men playing cards. A solitary fiddle drifting through the air from some distant fire. These sounds wrapped around us like a quilt, patches of calm stitched together by unsure hands. We returned to camp just as the last of the twilight faded. The fire at our company street flickered unevenly, its flames reflecting off the polished metal of stacked muskets. Larson sat nearby, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Captain says we drilled well today," he said as we approached. "Says we'd stand twice as long now as we did at Bull Run." Thompson leaned forward on his log seat, pipe glowing at the tip. "Twice as long ain't long enough if the Rebs fight like they did last time. But it's a start," I said quietly. He nodded, conceding the point. Night settled fully, bringing with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. The sky cleared, revealing a wide canvas of stars, crisp and bright above the ridgelines. Fires dotted the hills like constellations fallen to earth. Around them sat men, tired, humbled, determined. One by one, the soldiers of the 1st Minnesota drifted to their blankets. Some slept easily in the certainty of routine. Others tossed and turned, wrestling with images from Bull Run or with the demands of what lay ahead. As I lay back on my own blanket, hands folded beneath my head, I stared up at the stars and let my thoughts drift. In the beginning, I had imagined war as something simple: courage, musket fire, marching, victory. But Bull Run had shattered that illusion, and the weeks since had rebuilt it into something more complex, more burdensome, and somehow more real. War was fear, yes, but also duty. It was confusion, but also preparation. It was terror, but also trust. Trust in the men standing beside you, trust in the officers shaping you, trust in the cause that pulled you forward even when your legs trembled. And perhaps most of all, war was change. We had changed so much already. And I sensed that our greatest changes were still ahead. A gust of wind rustled the canvas overhead. In that moment, listening to the shifting leaves and the distant barking of a sentry's dog, I felt both small and strangely resolute. Whatever comes, I whispered into the night, we'll meet it together. I wasn't sure of who I was speaking to, God, the darkness, myself, but the words settled into the cool air like a promise. Crescent moon ending plus transition to the next episode. Smooth transition to episode 3. As autumn deepened and the nights grew colder, the camp outside Washington transformed into something formidable. Regiments drilled with renewed purpose. Forts rose higher. Cannons gleamed atop fresh earthworks. And the Army of the Potomac, shaken, humbled, reshaped, began to resemble an army worthy of its name. McClellan rode among us often now, inspecting, correcting, praising where praise was due. The men cheered him. Hope gathered behind him. Confidence grew. And yet, beneath all that rising strength, one truth beat like a second heart through the camp. This was only the beginning. Word spread that the general had a grand plan, an enormous campaign that would take us far from these forts, down the Potomac, across the rivers, deep into Virginia's heartland. Toward Richmond? Toward the enemy? Toward whatever fate awaited us next. And as winter approached and rumors hardened into certainty, I felt the weight of the coming storm settle over me like a thick cloak. Soon, we would march again. Not to defend. Not to retreat. But to invade. And that is where the next chapter of our story begins.